Hey there, and welcome. Today, we're diving deep into the biology of sex and how it shapes our gender. We're going to start with what you might call the standard blueprint, chromosomes and hormones. And then we'll see what happens when that blueprint has some interesting variations. It's a journey from a simple black and white picture to something way more colorful and fascinating. So let's get into it. Right, so I'm willing to bet that most of us learned in school that it's all pretty simple, right? XX means you're female, XY means you're male. End of story. But what if I told you that the actual biological story is, well, a lot more complicated and frankly, a lot cooler than that?
Okay, so to get our heads around this, we first need to understand the basic model that science starts with. We're going to call it the standard blueprint. Think of this as the most common pathway for how biological sex develops.
At the very heart of this blueprint are our chromosomes. These are literally the building blocks of life. They're these tightly packed bundles of DNA in our cells. We've got 23 pairs of them, and they carry all the genetic instructions for, well, everything that makes us who we are.
And when it comes to biological sex, it's that 23rd pair that really gets the ball rolling. This simple little pairing, either XX or XY, is what usually sets the first domino falling on the path to becoming either biologically female or male. Seems super straightforward, but trust me, the journey from this starting line is anything but.
So what is it about that Y chromosome that makes such a huge difference? Well, it pretty much all comes down to one single really powerful gene called the SRY gene. You can think of it like a master switch. If it's there, it flips on, and a whole cascade of events starts, all leading toward male development. And here's how that cascade works. If an embryo has a Y chromosome, that SRY gene flicks on at around 8 weeks. That one action triggers the development of testes. Those testes then start producing hormones like testosterone, which guide the rest of male development. Now here's the really important part. Without that SRY switch, the body's default path is female. It's just a wild example of how one tiny gene can have such a massive impact. But what happens when reality doesn't quite match that blueprint? This is where things get really interesting. We can actually test our understanding by looking at cases where development takes a different path. And we're not going to look at these as abnormalities, but as super important clues that help us understand the whole system way better.
So here's the main point we're making. If that simple XX/XY model told the whole story, then there just wouldn't be any exceptions. But there are, and those exceptions are incredibly useful for learning how this all really works. Okay, let's look at some evidence. A perfect example is Turner syndrome. This is a condition where a person has only one X chromosome. We write it as XO, instead of the usual XX. And it's not incredibly rare. It affects about 1 in every 2,000 people who are assigned female at birth. And having just that one X chromosome has some pretty big effects. So without the second X, the ovaries don't develop in the typical way, and that affects things like puberty and fertility. Physically, you might see traits like a broad, shield-like chest. But what's also really fascinating are the cognitive patterns. Studies often find that individuals with Turner syndrome tend to have higher than average reading and verbal skills, but they might struggle a bit more with things like spatial awareness. This really points to the X chromosome playing a big role in brain development too. So, what does a condition like Turner syndrome tell us about our blueprint? Well, it's pretty clear proof that chromosomes are absolutely vital, for sure, but they don't exist in a bubble. The number of sex chromosomes you have, not just the type, directly impacts everything from physical growth to cognitive strengths. Suddenly, that neat little XX/XY binary is starting to look a whole lot more complex, isn't it?
Okay, that brings us nicely to the next layer of this whole thing, hormones. We've talked about testosterone's role in the male blueprint, but the full hormonal story is, you guessed it, way more nuanced.
This is a huge misconception that we really need to clear up. There are no such things as male hormones or female hormones. Not really. Everybody's body produces a mix of all of them, androgens like testosterone and estrogens. The key thing isn't which hormones you have, it's the balance and concentration of them that matters.
And these different hormone levels can have real, measurable effects on the brain. For instance, a 2012 study looked at teenage girls and found a link between higher estrogen levels and more activity in the parts of the brain that handle social emotions. Now, this doesn't mean estrogen causes someone to act a certain way, but it does suggest that it might prime the brain to respond to social stuff in a particular way, which could influence what we see as typically female social behaviors.
But, and this is a really big but, we have to be super careful about drawing a straight line from what we see in animals to how humans behave.
Let's take oxytocin, for example. People call it the love hormone. In a ton of animal species, it's clearly linked to things like a mother caring for her young. In humans, the link is so much fuzzier. Our complex cultures and all the things we learn throughout our lives really muddy the waters, making it almost impossible to pin down a purely biological instinct.
And this right here is where it all starts to click into place. The best, most accurate way to look at gender development isn't about biology versus environment. It's about biology and environment working together. One of the absolute best ways we can see this interaction in action is by looking at a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, or CAH. It's a genetic condition where the body produces unusually high levels of male hormones, and it gives us this incredible, naturally occurring experiment.
So this condition affects XX individuals who get exposed to a lot of androgens before they're even born, and researchers have found some really interesting patterns. For instance, they often show a really strong preference for toys we typically think of as boys' toys. But, and this is the really critical part, that preference doesn't seem to apply to who they play with. They don't necessarily prefer to play with boys. This is so cool because it shows how those prenatal hormones can influence one part of gendered behavior, like toy choice, but not another, like social choice. It's a perfect example of biology and social learning interacting.
And that brings us to the big idea that ties all of this together. Interactionism. It's simply the idea that our nature, our biology, and our nurture, our environment and experiences aren't fighting each other. Instead, they're in a constant conversation, always working together to shape who we are.
So if you take one thing away from all this, let it be this. That old debate of nature versus nurture, it's over. It's just not a useful way to think about it anymore. It's not a competition, it's a collaboration. You could say that biology provides the raw ingredients, but it's our environment and experiences that shape how they all get mixed together.
So instead of a rigid blueprint, maybe a better metaphor is a complex recipe with a whole bunch of ingredients and steps. Let's just quickly recap the key takeaways. First, that standard XX/XY blueprint is definitely a powerful starting point, but cases like Turner syndrome prove it's not a simple binary. Second, hormones are more than just testosterone. Things like estrogen play really crucial, subtle roles. And finally, the best explanation we have is interactionism. It's that dynamic dance between nature and nurture that really tells the whole story.
And that really brings us to our final thought for today. Seeing it this way, through this interactionist lens, just opens up a much richer, more complex, and more accurate understanding. It makes us ask better questions. So I'll leave you with this one to think about. If biology gives us the ingredients, and society gives us the cooking method, what does the final recipe for gender truly look like for each and every one of us? Thanks for tuning in.